Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to another session of APUS History. Today, we are going to move forward to Lesson 3 of Unit 3, which is still from 1800. We're in time period 4, which is from 1800 to 1848. Today, we're going to talk about the era of good feeling in the election of 1824. Now, as we talk about this time period, it's important that we understand that we are post um, War of 1812, and we have a sense of feelings and things changing within society. So we're definitely seeing a a surge or a movement within society at this time that is definitely um, an alteration within society. We see this idea, this happiness, this enjoyment of moving west, and this idea of this era of good feeling. So, with that being said, let's move forward. So, we know that for the most part, people are moving westward. We know that at this point, we have society looking at this movement, this idea of moving westward. We see that post War of 1812, there are these push and pull factors that are driving people westward into this frontier. When we think of push and pull, we think of the like overcrowded cities in the tidewater areas is pushing people out of the city, and then the opportunity for cheap land and the opportunity to have something they've never had before are pulling people to this land. Now, granted, we do have the indigenous people out there, but we know that they were kind of the losers of the War of 1812, and we're going to see them for the most part. We see a lot of pushing of these people out of this region. And once again, forcing them in the reservations or even forcing the indigenous people west past the Mississippi River. We also see that the population in the first, 20 years of the 1800s, we see the population double. We see farmland is moving out west. We see that land is very cheap at this time, and you can buy a minimum of 80 acres. So there is this encouragement of getting people to move westward. We also see there's a natural kind of highway to moving west, and that is the Cumberland Gap. We will see this movement of the Cumberland Gap. It's kind of a natural type of highway through the Appalachian Mountains. And we see, for the most part, the Cumberland Gap is here in this region here near Kentucky, just south of the Ohio River Valley. So we'll see a lot of people come through the Tennessee and the Cumberland Gap to head west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, James Monroe will win the election of 1816. He'll win the election of 1816, and a lot of people look at his election of winning the election. He'll be sworn in 1817, but this starts what they call the era of good feeling. This idea he was one of the founding fathers. He is one of these people that a lot of good things are going to happen under his presidency when it comes to foreign policies, but we are going to start to see more sectionalism developing during his presidency. There's a lot of debate at this time about tariffs and banks and internal improvements. By this time, it's called the era of good feeling because there's no federalist there. He pretty easily wins the election because, for the most part, there's very little support for the Federalist Party anymore. Some say this era of good feeling went from the election of 1816 to the panic of 1819. But once again, we call it the era of good feeling because there was a weak, unorganized opposition of the Federalists that's not really standing tall. His Secretary of State is going to be John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams. He's a great Secretary of State, a great foreign policy guy, but will not make a very good president. Um, he's good at delegating things around him, and he's really Monroe is a pretty solid president. We know his Secretary of War of John C. Calhoun, and Calhoun will be someone that later on will be someone that um, looks at the ideas of succession in 1832. John C. Calhoun will talk about the ideas of succession. Now, for the most part, we see these Jeffersonian Republicans are kind of running away with everything, the Democratic Republicans, but we are going to start to see kind of a fracture of those politicians as time goes by. We will see here the Democratic Republicans, under the Jeffersonian idea, started when Jefferson left the cabinet, and we'll see the Federalists kind of head things. Then, with the death of the Federalists, we'll see during the War of 1812, we pretty much see this one party rule under the era of good feeling. But during Monroe's presidency, we will see kind of a split of the Republican Party where we see that Jacksonian idea of the Democratic Republicans, so people that will follow the Jacksonian ideas, and then we find the national republics that follow the ideas of Clay and moves towards the Whigs and the Republicans of modern day present time. We will see this new Republican Party, which is today's modern day Republican Party, with the first presidential Republican will be Abraham Lincoln. So during Monroe's presidency, there becomes an issue about infrastructure and tariffs and the national bank. So Henry Clay is going to come up with this idea called the American system. Now, part of this American system will already be put in place by the time Monroe actually is sworn in as president. We will see there are three components of the American system. We will see the idea of rechartering the national bank, the second bank of the United States. We will see the infrastructure. We'll see roads and canals being built. We want to build national roads. We want to build canals. We want to create some infrastructure. And then lastly, we want to put in protective tariffs. We want to improve our internal financial institutions, but build tariffs that we can raise money to help with our infrastructure. And both, believe it or not, both the North and the South are supporting this idea. Um, this idea of the American system fosters the economic and commercial conditions in which both the yeoman farmer and the merchant could succeed. It creates a strong national currency. And once again, this tariff of 1860 was put in to protect domestic manufacturing, protect the development of the American industry. So we see this. This is Henry Clay's uh, system here called the American system. So this will be put in place, and it's really kind of a foundation of our country here early on about helping manufacturing, helping with the yeoman farmer, moving products from place to place, whether it's building roads, railroads, canals. Now, there will be some constitutionality when it comes to infrastructure. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say that the federal government should pay for infrastructure. So a lot of the infrastructure had to be paid for by states. They had to pay for it themselves. But we'll see that develop and that controversy develop over time. Now, one example we'll see is the development of the Erie Canal. They'll start breaking ground on the Erie Canal, which helps create this passageway through the northern part of New York that connects essentially the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes. Now, it won't be open until 1825, but it will start with the American system. We'll start to see this push towards this infrastructure that will help our economics. Now, John Quincy Adams is, like I said before, a really good. He's a good politician when it comes to his job as a Secretary of State. He's good with foreign policies, and that's what he deals with. Now, once again, as a president, he's not going to be that good of a president when it comes to uh, his election later on when he deals with. Um, he'll only serve one term as a president with the corrupt bargain. Um, but as a Secretary of State, he's a really good guy. And some things that we're going to see. He's going to help get the Rush-Bagot Treaty passed in 1817. There's some issues dealing with the northern part of the United States where the Louisiana Purchase ends. Where does that end between Canada and the United States? So he will help with this Rush-Bagot agreement to use and settle on the 49th parallel. We also see with the Treaty of 1818, which is essentially part of the Rush-Bagot Treaty, they're going to resolve disputes over the Oregon Territory in the Northwest. We also see that he is going to help push through the Transcontinental Treaty of 1819, which will get America um, that that little bit of land that is in the Gulf of Mexico region that the Spanish had continued to keep. Spain will give up Florida or any kind of other previous claims into that Louisiana territory and in Oregon. So it's going to kind of push them downward. Now, in that Florida, that little panhandle area, we did see that it was an area of runaway slaves and bandits and Native Americans living in that region. So we wanted to really kind of lay claim to it and control these territories because some bad people, some of these bandits that were living in this little area here, were coming up into the United States and essentially attacking settlers that were moving out west. So we wanted to secure that area and also to keep the natives in check because once again we were going to force natives to move out west. So we can see here in this picture here, we can see the Rush-Bagot treaty up here, the 49th parallel up here. We also see this is part of that 1818 treaty up here. And then we see this additional land. Let me get the, well, where's my, there it is. We're going to secure this area down here from the Spanish. And we're also going to make sure that this line is put in place here so that the Spanish cannot go any further north. So we're kind of solidifying what is kind of modern day America, but we will continue to move westward. We will pay Spain money for the land that we will take or claim later on. Now, when we think about Florida, there is a large amount of indigenous. The Seminoles are in Florida, and we know after the War of 1812 that Andrew Jackson was still down that way with after defeating the British in the Battle of New Orleans. So we're going to see the first Seminole War from 1816 to 1819, where Andrew Jackson is going to lead the way there. He's going to attack and destroy a Negro fort in Florida in 1816 from runaway slaves. And we'll see later on in 1835 to 1842, we'll have another Seminole War and we'll put in place the Indian Removal Act. And then again, right before um, the Civil War, we'll see the Third Seminole War. Once again, trying to remove indigenous people, capture runaway slaves. If there were any bandits or bad people, criminals that were down there in that area, we were trying to round them up so that settlers can go there and farm. Now, We will eventually see, and some people will argue that the era of good feeling essentially ends with the Panic of 1819. Um, Others will say that the era of good feeling will continue until we start to see multiple parties develop. But this Panic of 1819 is the first major panic that we've addressed. Our federal bank was trying to tighten credit to avoid superinflation after the War of 1812. Um, and as we tighten credit, we see that this panic showed how far our country has moved since 1800, from that Jeffersonian republic of the yeoman farmer towards a nationally our nation dominated by commerce. We see that banks will close. We'll see an increase in unemployment. We will see bankruptcy. We'll see people being debtors prison and people being thrown in prison. And what we're seeing here is that as European powers recover, they demand the demand for American crops and products will decrease. So as Europe develops after all the wars and the Napoleonic Wars, they're not going to really need as much things from us as they did before. When we think of us moving out west, we had so much land speculating going on. People were going out west and buying up land. Banks were buying up land. It was like this idea: we'll buy land and then we'll turn around and sell it and make money. But unfortunately, people weren't moving to the west as fast as they had hoped, and therefore, people that were purchasing land with the hopes to sell it were not getting the amount of profits they thought, and they're going to start to essentially lose their shirt, so to speak, with the lack of money to pay off the loans. We know that cotton prices will fall um, uh, because of the tariffs and because of Europe not buying as much from. There's the demand is down for the products. So when cotton prices fell, manufacturing imports were being taxed, and so no one bought them, and there was no need for cotton. So we saw this trickle down effect. So we really need to do something to try to help the economy boom. And this is the first really economic panic that our nation has dealt with. Now, many people lost money in the bank in the Panic of 1819. Andrew Jackson, who we know is a war hero, had taken pretty much all his money and invested it into the land speculating out because everyone said everyone's going to move west and invest, invest, invest. And he took pretty much all his money and invested it out west. And unfortunately for him, he lost everything. Now, this is important to know because when Andrew Jackson becomes president, he's going to despise the national bank and do everything to try to destroy the bank because essentially the banks destroyed him right after he had invested into land speculating. Now, when we think about what's going on in going out west, we have to understand that we're starting to settle states and more territory, and then there's this area called the Missouri Territory right here. Now, we know that people are moving westward. We know that there's all about this idea of the acquisition of lands, where we have economic pressures to move westward. We have improved transportation. And then immigrants are coming to America with the idea of moving westward. So we see in the early 1820s and 30s, we're going to get a huge bump of immigration coming to America. And we'll see a lot of German immigrants moving to the Great Plains, out to the west to farm. We'll see a lot of Irish immigrants work in industrial areas, more in the Northeast, but we do see this push for more and more land. So the question became, what do we do with the ideas of succession, or not succession, with the ideas of creating statehood? Now we know that the with the Northwest Ordinance, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, eventually Michigan and Wisconsin, they can enter statehood, but there's no slaves allowed in that territory north of the Ohio River. But the Ohio River, if you could see it, if the Ohio River runs along here and then joins the Mississippi here. So, what do we do about slavery in Missouri? So, this becomes a big issue of what we're going to do with slavery in Missouri. So, we're going to see this thing called the Missouri Compromise. Um, at this point, when you think of the Missouri Compromise, we've had a sectionalism balance for a long time. We had 11 states on each side for slaves and against slavery going on. And we want to keep this balance of power. Now, because of population, we will see the House of Representatives will start to switch. But because of uh, uh, the Senate, we'll see this idea of balance with 11 and 11. So we want to try to maintain this balance. So Henry Clay is going to draft an idea called the Missouri Compromise. Now, this Missouri Compromise, once again, it's a band aid to some bigger issues. The Missouri Compromise will provide admission of Maine as a free state and Missouri as a slave state. This will subdue issues about slavery for a while. This was only a temporary solution. We still see, sectionalism balance between North and South, but once again, there will be this idea of feeling of nationalism versus loyalty to your region. Now, so Missouri will enter as a slave state and Maine will enter as a free state, but they're also going to draw this line, this 3630 line, dividing line between southern or between slave territories and free territories. And like I said, this compromise was sufficient for a while, but it will later on be kind of deemed well, not kind of, it will be deemed unconstitutional, and it will really cut a clear sectionalism divide. If we take a look at the map here, we can see this 3630 line that represents the ideas of, of territories north and south. Now, this line, as you can see here, it stops right here at the end of the Louisiana Purchase. So essentially, Missouri will be a slave state right here, but all this other territory right here, this territory here of the Louisiana Purchase, would have to be a free state. And it would be free states. And then right here, this little territory here would be the only area that can come in Florida as slave states. Because technically, America doesn't go any further than this area right here. So let me see if I can get a different color here. Oh, I guess I can't get any different color besides red. There we go. So we can't really say that this line can go past this point. Now, when we do practice manifest destiny and we do come all the way across, all the way to California, people will start to wonder, does this line extend or does it still stop right here? Because that will create more sectional conflict to determine whether or not slavery will expand this way. That will be a huge sectionalism conflict about that at that time, as time goes by, I should say. So we could see, once again, this Missouri Compromise line right here, 3630. Okay. And so now Missouri will join as a slave state, Maine will join as a free state. Now, we also see the growth or the idea of this thing called a manifest destiny. You were supposed to read the Monroe Doctrine. This Monroe Doctrine is essentially written and constructed um, and kind of put in place with John Quincy Adams, being the Secretary of State. But we're going to see that this Monroe Doctrine, at this time, this is post Napoleonic Wars. Okay. Did I mention? I'm sorry. Did I mention the Missouri Compromise was 1820? Oh, I don't remember if I I stated that. The Missouri Compromise is 1820. Okay. All right. I'm just looking at years now because now this Monroe Doctrine, it will be written in 1823. And we're going to see this is post European, like the Napoleonic Wars. And we're going to see a lot of monarchies restoring power in Europe, and the US was pretty fearful that these European countries and these monarchs are going to want to reclaim or claim land in the Americas. And we were really concerned with that. We didn't want them to come in and take land that we may want to have, or to set up trade and dominate trade. So we're concerned with that. So we write this Monroe Doctrine, and it's kind of, I have the little dog there, Ruff Ruff. It's kind of a very loud bark from a little dog. We're still a young nation, but we're being pretty powerful here. Um, John Quincy Adams is worried about the issues with Latin America. The U.S. is recognizing independence in Latin America and didn't want Europe in there, right? So the basic components of the Monroe Doctrine is that North and South America would no longer be open to European colonization. Existing colonies would not be bothered by the U.S., but eventually they're going to disappear. European colonies in the north, in the Western Hemisphere, would forever be lost. Eventually, they're going to be gone and lost forever. And then the U.S. would not involve itself in any affairs in the Eastern or in European nations. So it's almost like we don't care what happens in the Eastern Hemisphere as long as you don't come over here into the Western Hemisphere. So essentially, America becomes kind of like, we're going to protect the Western Hemisphere. That's really what this Monroe Doctrine is about. Now, we don't really use this very much at this point. John Polk will use this in the Mexican American War. But for the most part, we don't really use the Monroe Doctrine until we get to World War One and World War II. We'll stay out of the League of Nations because of the Monroe Doctrine, and then we stay out of World War II until after Pearl Harbor, and then we won't follow the Monroe Doctrine after that because we belong to the United Nations now. But we'll use the Monroe Doctrine to enter in World War One, World War II, in the Spanish American War, in the Mexican American War. But once again, we're trying to protect the Western Hemisphere. So that's part of or that is the Monroe Doctrine. We will see Teddy Roosevelt will write the Roosevelt Corollary later on after the Spanish American War. Now, we also see a series of court cases that are put in place during this time period, during the era of good feeling. We see the McCulloch versus Maryland and the Gibbons versus Ogden court cases that happened during the era of good feelings. Now, with the McCulloch versus Maryland court case, it's really about state versus federal power. Who has the most power? And we're going to see in this court case that um, the state of Maryland is essentially going to try to tax a federal bank that's in Maryland. And when the federal bank refused to pay the tax, they're actually going to arrest the McCulloch, who's in charge of the bank, and put him essentially in like a debtor's prison. So what's going to happen is the the Supreme Court is going to rule that the federal laws are supreme over states, okay, and that there's an implied power in our Constitution for a national bank that essentially the that the state could not tax a federal institution because once again the federal government has power over the states, okay, so they can't do this in reverse. And then the Gibbons versus Ogden court case essentially sets the idea that the federal government has the right to regulate commerce, and we're going to see the state of New York tried to essentially give a monopoly to water rights to two firms, and the Supreme Court essentially says that you can't. give water rights that are accessible to everyone to just two firms. So this landmark decision allowed the federal government to regulate interstate commerce. So there's two. So here, once again, we see that they convicted McCulloch, the manager of the branch, the Baltimore branch, for not paying taxes levied on him. That went up to the Maryland Court of Appeals, and then that eventually led to the McCulloch versus Maryland court case that went and saw in front of the Supreme Court and Chief Justice Marshall. So essentially, they established a constitutional justification to establish national banks. And they also said that Maryland does not have the power to tax a national bank within the state, federal over state. And then here, the Supreme Court under Chief Justice John Marshall, this court with the Gibbons versus Ogden, once again declared that more power to the federal government and gave the federal government the right to regulate interstate commerce. So by this time, you should be able to explain the American system, the Henry Clay's American system, and the three components of it. You should be able to explain the four components of the Monroe Doctrine, and you should be able to explain why the period from 1816 to 1824 was known as the Era of Good Feeling, and whether or not this name is correct. If we think about the Era of Good Feeling, it's a good feeling for Democratic Republican males. Is it an era of good feeling for women? Is it an era of good feeling for indigenous people? Is it an era of good feeling for slaves or blacks at this time? So really, it's an era of good feeling for Jeffersonian followers, because there is no Federalist party really for the most part. So hopefully this was helpful to you. And until next time, have a great day.